The agenda this week reconsidered the Red Chamber, checked in with the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, heard the case in favor of Britain's exit from the EU, and looked at the rise of the drone in U.S. counterterrorism. And the agenda's weekend review begins with the transformation of rookies to seasoned MPPs.
Diane, how much does it bother you when an opposition member will get up there and level a comment about the government that you think is just dead wrong, and you're sort of supposed to sit there and take it?
Well, and then there's the heckling. And the really bizarre thing, and I'm still not used to this, is that half an hour later when you're in the dining room downstairs and you're lining up to get a bowl of soup, that same guy comes up to you and says, "Hey, Diane, how are you? How's it going?" And I'm thinking, half an hour ago, you were just screaming and heckling at us and calling us everything but four-letter words.
But out of fairness,
how is this possible?
But out of fairness, the government side also heckles the opposition.
Some
it
do.
happens,
Yes, some do.
it happens to us as well.
That's true.
But it's kind of like a hockey game.
Yeah.
You fight on the ice, and then you step out of the chamber, and that's, in most cases, that's forgotten.
Imagine someone named Gretzky using a hockey analogy. You did find that weird then, the first time that somebody...
I still find it weird.
Yeah.
But I know that between 10:30 and 11:30 every morning, that's when we have question period. That's when all the TV cameras are there. And that's when everyone who's speaking switches it on and they're performing. There's a lot of theatrics and a lot of histrionics, and I still marvel at all of this.
But if I can add, there's a positive side to all of this too, right? And I think that's what some of us are touching on, which is when we do walk out of that room or we do bump into each other along the way. You know, Jennifer and I chat all the time. You know, we all, there's a certain camaraderie that you may not expect when it comes to politics, that even though we're talking about party politics, there's also this sense that we are here, there's respect, I guess is what I'm saying. There's respect on all sides for each of us, and we know we're all there to do a job, and the job is to represent our people and our voters to the best of our ability. So even though we may be on opposite sides of an issue at times, I really walk away just feeling totally energized on occasion when I bump into you, you know, and we're sharing a coffee or some food together, or Jennifer and I have a chat after a committee meeting. And those things leave you with this feeling that, you know what, we're here trying to do the right thing. We may be going about it in different ways, but ultimately in the end, we're here because we want to represent the people and our voters.
You know what's funny? I was at question period last week, I guess, and in the elevator after it was over, woman, I guess, in probably late 20s, and a member of the public, no affiliation with politics, and I said to her, "So what'd you think of all that?" And it was a day when there was a lot of heckling going on. I said, "What'd you think of all that?" And she said, "Fabulous energy."
Must have been a conservative.
I don't know what she was. I didn't ask.
I think what that comes out of, though, is, I mean, we're all human beings. And I think Eleanor touched on it in the beginning. I'd like to think we're all in it for the right reason. We all want to make a difference, and our ideas of what that difference is may be different, but we're all in it because we want to help people. So I think for the most part, the heckling is because you feel so passionately about something is going to actually help your constituents, that's where that comes out of. It's emotion. Now, there is sometimes heckling that I think is inappropriate. It gets very personal. But I think a lot of the heckling that goes on, as Diane said, sometimes it's for the cameras. But I think that comes out of a passion for thinking that you know what's right for your constituents and you want the other side to hear that.
I'm mortified when there's kids there, though, and they're watching.
And there
this,
almost always are. When you say it gets personal, let's explore this just a little bit. How sexist does the heckling get? Well,
that could be an hour show, I think, some days. Sometimes it's out of line. Sometimes there are some members that I don't know how to put it diplomatically, but sometimes, yes, it becomes very sexist.
Do you go over and tell them afterwards that's not cool?
Sometimes, and sometimes, in all honesty, it's not. You're so heated. It's so personal. Myself, I haven't gone right over afterwards and addressed it because I might say something that I, in the end, regret saying it the way that I have.
I want to explore this a little further because I don't think there's any question that the floor of the legislature is not as sexist a place as it was, say, 50 years ago. But I have 5 female MPPs here, so I do need to ask. Jennifer, is it still a pretty sexist place to work?
I think, well, I come out of a predominantly female profession. You know, I come out at, well, yes, and majority female caucus. So I was leaving, you know, teaching for this, and so I have found a few new challenges. But I think it is a workplace, not unlike any other in Ontario, where there is room for improvement and where you're going to have that interpersonal push and pull. I think
You get it though? Have you had it? You had people make sexist comments at you?
I don't know that I'd call them sexist. I would say that everyone has a different version of what boundaries are, and so you need to make sure that you make clear what yours are. That might have been a little too personal. So next time we're going to keep it professional, right? You know.
Eleanor, you run into this?
I haven't had much sexist stuff, but I will say this, it may seem controversial, but I think men and women come from different places. They have different energy about how they do their jobs, and you see it really show up in the legislature because feelings run high, and as you were mentioning, sometimes things are said in the heat of the moment. And I think that, to Diane's point earlier, when you're standing next to the person in the buffet line and when the feelings are shared, it's really hard to switch that off and then sort of take it to another place. You have to learn to do that. That's certainly how I have navigated, because we are all human beings. And when things are said, it can feel hurtful sometimes. And so you have to learn how to navigate that and how to manage it.
We just had a huge issue come before the House of Commons. Didn't make its way to you yet because obviously the doctor-assisted dying bill didn't make it through the House on the timetable that the government of the day hoped. But take us into the back rooms. At some point, does the Prime Minister take you aside and say, we are going to get this bill through, and when we do, I need you to get it through fast because we've got a June 6th deadline the Supreme Court has put on us?
The Prime Minister has not spoken to me about the getting the business of government through the Senate since I was appointed.
Not once?
He's been very clear that he respects the independence, that he's provided me and my mandate, and he's asking me to bring forward the government's legislative agenda in the Senate and to have it dealt with appropriately by the Senate. And I'm working with my colleagues to do just that. And that's the task that we have with this bill, as we have with other bills that are coming before us in the coming number of weeks.
Is he aware that that will likely take more time given the newfound independence of some of the senators?
Well, look, governing is a complex and time-consuming task, and I am sure the Prime Minister is well aware of time, and legislative time is a precious commodity, but we have to undertake our responsibilities in a deliberative, respectful, and not hurried but expeditious way.
Can I ask you about that? Because this is such a topical issue. So I'm sure that you were sort of anticipating the moment when that bill was passed and that you would have to, as an independent senator, bring whatever it was to bear that you were going to do with this. It hasn't happened. So what's your feeling now about how you balance your responsibilities between those elected people whose job it is to get those bills passed and laws passed and your independent status to give sober second thought to what they do?
Well, the moment I arrived in Ottawa, I began attending the Legal and Constitutional Committee of the Senate, not as a member, because I might differ with Ratna on how civil things are. I think there's a thin veneer there.
Yeah,
but
it's not that civil.
we're not yet, the new people are not yet members because of partisan wrangling that's going on. But that doesn't matter. I went to all of those hearings. I questioned witnesses when I could. At the end of the list, but I got my questions in. I've been listening, I've been reading, I've been pursuing discussions with people about the Constitution and about what the Carter decision meant and trying to come to my own decision. What's fascinating for me is that this bill, as it comes through, and as I think about it on behalf of Canadians who want to ensure that whatever the bill is, it guarantees what they believe their rights are under the Constitution, and that's an issue of debate. But that's squarely in the mandate of the review of the Senate. One of the things we're supposed to look at is constitutional compliance. And so here's the first day arriving, the first big bill that we're doing, and when it comes to us, the question, I don't know what further amendments might or might not be made in the House of Commons at this point, but the first question for me will be, does it meet constitutional compliance? Does it meet a test of that? And there's a lot of opinions about that floating around out there, legal opinions on that. And then secondly, and I've been, I think, quite forthright and open in talking with Senator Harder in him his job that he is doing to understand where things are going, to say, as of last week when I left, my point of view was that I think we need to do an amendment to the bill and give advice back that makes this compliant with the Carter decision. I don't think it is at this point in time. I'm still pursuing that answer to satisfy myself, but that's where I'm at, and I've given that indication. If it goes back, let's say, with a recommendation for that kind of amendment, and it comes back to us without that amendment being made, then what's squarely in my purview to make a decision on is, at what point have we exercised our judgment, have we given best advice, and do we defer to the elected House of Commons, that's the democratically elected, accountable side of Parliament in a bicameral system where we are not that. We have a different role. And I don't know the answer to that, Steve.
You haven't figured that out yet.
I'm struggling.
Every day I get up and I read about what people are saying, and I get emails from, this is the other thing, you hear from Canadians. Thousands of Canadians who will write to you with their stories, with their point of view. The witnesses that I have listened to and been around the table with at committees are cogent, they're convincing, they have evidence, they're passionate, and then the next set of witnesses come, and they're equally cogent and convincing. So there are days when I think it is too restrictive. And there are days I think maybe it's a little too permissive. And there are other days I think maybe it strikes the right middle of the road Canadian balance. I have to listen very carefully in the next few days as the Senate sits down and hears more witnesses and hears from the ministers. And I have to listen very carefully to the amendments that are being proposed and then figure out, once we've done our duty, which is not stand in the way of the elected public, but add value and maybe send back bills in extraordinary. So this is a matter of life and death. Mm-hmm. This is different from any other bill.
Have you figured out yet what your role is going to be in the doctor-assisted dying bill?
Well, it's certainly not to phone anybody and say, we've got to get this passed. That's not how I see my job. That's not how it was described to me. So I'm not seeing that as part of the expectation on my part.
I want to just take a moment to focus on call to action number 19, because it talks about closing the gaps in health outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities, and specifically refers to the suicide and mental health crises that we have heard so much about lately, in particular at Awapiskat. And I wonder what approaches you think will best serve the people in Attawapiskat to take those appallingly tragic circumstances out of the headlines and find some improvements for those poor people.
Well, first of all, I just want to point out that most of our early recommendations from Call to Action 1 all the way through to the first 25 or so calls to action were really aimed at getting information together so that we could have a proper conversation about causes and effects and benefits. The Government of Canada had stopped doing statistical gathering relating to Indigenous people for the last several years, and as a result, there was very little upon which one could base proper decision-making going forward. And so in our calls to action relating to child welfare, education, incarceration rates, for example, we said that we need to get that data together so that we can start measuring success and looking at causes. The ones relating to health focused upon the issue of mental health and the issue of suicide rates because they're at a critical point. They were then, a year ago, they are now. They have been for some time, and they will be for some time into the future, because the issue of children or young people who are wanting to take their lives is a reflection of the despair that they feel about where they fit into society. It's a reflection of the despair that they feel about the poverty, about the housing situation, about the living conditions in their community, about their family relationships, about the dysfunction within their families that have come about because of the impact of residential schools, about the ongoing violence, which many would argue, and I think we would support at the Commission, stemmed from the violence that residential school survivors experience in residential schools, and which perpetuates itself in violence in the home. And for those young people, as Frantz Fanon, a famous sociologist, said in 1947, initially their violence is going to be turned inwards. So it'll be in forms of self-abuse, such as alcohol and drug abuse, and self-abuse in the forms of suicide and attempted suicide rates. But eventually that violence is going to turn outward. So it'll be manifest itself in violence to neighbors and violence to family members. But it could also manifest itself in violence against society and against the state. And so we need to be concerned about it as a society, that we address it completely now and do something that will allow those young people to find ways of feeling more hope about their lives and their future. And what we said is that we need to fix the way that the educational system in their communities works, so that they do feel that they're getting an education which helps them to find answers for themselves, that are truthful to their past, truthful to their sense of self and their identity, and gives them self-respect and pride. And that also they can see employment opportunities being realistic for them, whether within their community, near their community, or in other parts of the country. And we also need to ensure that they can feel that they have a safe environment in which to grow up as young people, and that they're not living constantly in a life of danger, whether that danger is passive in the forms of inadequate food supplies or inadequate living conditions, or whether it's more aggressive in terms of violence in the homes that they live in. All of that needs to be addressed. In addition to that, we say that young people today, young Indigenous people today, suffer dramatically from loss of identity, loss of self-respect, and loss of pride, which has been engendered for many generations, and they can't find answers from their families. They can't find answers in their communities because their elders and their family members have themselves lost their sense of identity. And when young people are growing up in the teenage years and as young adults, they want to know who they are. They want to be validated. They want to feel that this country has a place for them and that they have a place in it that means something, and they want to feel that there's a future here, and they want to feel positive about all of that. And right now, we're not giving them that. And until we can do that, we will constantly be fighting critical issues in the crisis, emergency kind of way, as we are now. And we can't keep responding in that way because it's inadequate.
I'm passionate about wanting my country to leave the European Union, but the European Union does do some good things, not least on environmental regulation. But overall, you look at the continent at the moment, and you look at the mass youth unemployment across the south of Europe. 50% rates of unemployment in places like Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece, most of all. What's being done to Greece at the moment by a monetary and austerity policy, I think, amounts to almost a kind of political vivisection. It's awful what is happening to Greece. Europe's failure to confront Vladimir Putin's destabilization of Ukraine. You look at the rise of extreme governments in Hungary, illiberal, anti-immigration, world go-away governments in Hungary and Poland. You look at Spain and Greece's failure to have a stable government. This is a continent in crisis, and the longer we are chained to a continent that is losing its share of world trade twice as fast as America's, I think we are not getting a good deal.
You call it a continent in crisis, but everything's relative. This is a continent where France and Germany have not gone to war against each other in a very long time.
Yeah.
I mean, there's crisis and then there's crisis. One could argue that it's more problematic for the UK to be sort of hitched to Europe in some respects, economically, of course, while being outside the European Union. You don't see that as a problem?
I don't want us to not be good neighbours of the European Union. I want us to be good neighbours rather than unhappy tenants. I'd like us to still be a part of a free trade relationship with Europe. I want us to be active members of NATO. I want the same bilateral cooperation that happens between intelligence agencies to continue.
So that's not being a tenant, that's being a co-owner, isn't it?
It's being a partner.
But when I think Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize, months after becoming president, before he'd even really done anything, the European Union won the Nobel Peace Prize, I think 1 or 2 years before. That was the wrong award. The thing that kept peace in the European, on the European continent, which, as you stress, is incredibly important given Europe's history, was NATO. And it was the commitment of American, Canadian, and other troops to the defense and stabilization of Europe. That's what made Europe stable. It was free trade between countries that made them economically integrated with each other. Easier to buy something from another nation than to steal it by war. Europe has ceased to just be a free trade area, though now it has ambitions to become a nation. And Britain doesn't want to be part of that. We're quite happy to be our own independent nation.
You must know Hugo Dixon.
Yes.
Hugo writes in The Independent the following: "At the moment when we negotiate with America, China, or Japan, we are doing so as part of the world's largest trade bloc, which accounts for nearly 20% of the world GDP. Washington, Beijing, and Tokyo have to take Brussels seriously as a trade partner. If we were on our own, the balance of power would be quite different. The U.S. economy is 7 times as big as ours, the Chinese is 5 times as big, and Japan's is twice our size. We typically have to play by their rules, whereas at the moment, we influence the EU's product regulations, which then have a chance of becoming global standards." You don't agree with him?
There is some truth to what he says, but it's also the case that there are 26 member states in the European Union. So when the European Union sits down with those trading blocs that he mentions, we kind of have 1/26 of the voice.
But you're at the table at least.
Well, we're not. The European Union is at the table. Perhaps a Portuguese commissioner or a French commissioner. Are they really have uppermost in their mind the Welsh steel industry or the City of London's financial district? Whereas, yes, we'd be Britain rather than this larger European Union if we were sat at the table in those trade talks. But our focus would be entirely on British interests. The European Union is incredibly slow at negotiating free trade agreements because it only can move as fast as the slowest vehicle in the convoy. We could move much more quickly in Britain's relationship with America or Canada because we have that democratic flexibility. So yes, we may have slightly less negotiating weight if we're on our own, but we'll be more nimble and more focused on our own interests.
Here's some more advice for you, whether you want it or not.
I sense I'm going to get it.
Here's Jochen Bittner, political editor of Die Zeit, giving advice to the British people in the pages of the New York Times. He writes, "Do you really want to look on now, a spectator like Switzerland, as Europe retreats into illiberalism and protectionism, and its eastern fringes drift into the orbit of a neo-imperial Russia? You can't isolate yourself from these. You can only worsen them by refusing to do your part. We need British voices, insistent, contrary, and maddening, to disturb decades of self-satisfied dust that has settled over Brussels. We don't just need a union that demands reform from its member states, we also need member states that demand and secure reform from the union. Don't leave the job half finished. Don't leave us Europeans alone with this European Union." How about that?
Well, look, there's a few more grey hairs on my head than I would like. But I've probably been watching European politics for a good 20, 25 years through adult eyes. We've been members of this club for 40 years. I can't remember a time when people said, Europe is about to change, Britain is beginning to have influence. And actually, we have never had decisive influence. We have never been able to stop the kind of project like the Euro project that has caused so much social misery.
Well, you didn't stop it, but you're not part of it.
We're not part of it, but the quote that you just gave me was a call for Britain to help Europe succeed.
Sure.
But if you are constantly ignored, twice as likely to be outvoted in European Council than any other nation, after a while you just sort of get, we're part of this club, but the club doesn't really respect us and take us seriously.
Alaki somehow, on 9/11/2001, says this is a terrible thing.
Yeah.
This is a horrible thing, what's happened to the United States.
Yes.
And then somehow, over the intervening years, becomes one of the leading proponents of terrorism in the world.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Well, that's one reason I set out to write this book. Is I've been writing about terrorism like a lot of other reporters since 9/11, 2001, and you know, a question that has always preoccupied me is what brings a person to devote his life to killing dozens or hundreds of strangers. You know, what can motivate somebody to do that? And his case, as you point out, is a particularly sort of baffling one. He spent just about half of his 40 years in the U.S. He was seemingly very happy. He began to raise a family there. He had a really strikingly successful career as a young imam. And as you say, he made a reputation after 9/11, denouncing 9/11, saying in fact that the particular role of American Muslims was to be a bridge between the United States and 1 billion Muslims around the world. And this guy ends up with Al-Qaeda. So that was one reason I set out to write this book.
And as you point out in the book, it's his father who says, whatever happened to my son happened in America. He didn't get radicalized somewhere else. It happened in America.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think the radicalization had its roots in America, but what I think the father was referring to was his interest in religion. I mean, his brother told me a revealing story for his younger brother, who was sort of watching Anwar pack to go off to the U.S. He had spent his first 7 years in the States, went back with his parents to Yemen, lived there until he was 19, and then his dad said, I want you to go to college in the U.S., and he was sending him to Colorado State to study engineering. So he's packing, and his mother keeps putting in a prayer rug, and Anwar keeps taking it out, saying, kind of embarrassed, but saying, Mom, I'm going to America, I don't need this. And she would put it in, and he'd take it out. So he had no real interest in religion at that time. But it was actually at Colorado State that he fell in with some conservative older Muslim students and took, sort of embraced religion very enthusiastically, shall we say.
Didn't stop him from going to prostitutes.
No, and one of the real turns in this story is that at the height of his fame in the U.S., after 9/11, he's in the Washington Post, he's in the New York Times, he's on television, he's on the radio, and he's really sort of forging a career as a very articulate and charismatic spokesperson for Islam, sort of explaining Islam to all these baffled, to a baffled audience that kind of wants to understand, what's Islam, what's Al-Qaeda, and at the height of his fame, preaching at a conservative, big, influential congregation right outside Washington, D.C., he, it turns out, is also taking afternoons off every week or two to visit prostitutes in American hotels. He's married, he has 3 kids, and he's preaching about the sanctity of marriage.
Kind of a bit off-brand, wouldn't you say?
A bit off-brand, and so that's when a real turn in this story comes, because the FBI, it turns out, unbeknownst to him, has been following him around out of concern that perhaps he has radical ties. They satisfy themselves that he has no radical ties, but they also discover this illicit habit that he has, and he finds out that they know about his visits to prostitutes, and that causes him to leave the United States in a big hurry.
Well, here is some of what he wrought, and I'm just going to take a half a minute here to go through a bit of a list. 9/11, some recall him having closed-door discussions with 2 of the Saudi hijackers in his office. He may have also been a spiritual advisor to 3 of the hijackers. The London subway bombings in 2005, 3 of the 4 terrorists attended one of his lectures. Here in Toronto, the Toronto 18 terrorism plot in 2006, young Canadians plotting to behead the Prime Minister. They watched his videos. The 2009 Fort Hood shooting in Texas. Aleki was in touch with the shooter, denounced Muslim soldiers who fight against other Muslims. He later called the killer a hero. 2009, a young Nigerian, Umar Farouk Abdullah Matolab, so-called underwear bomber, unsuccessfully tried to detonate his explosives in a Christmas flight over Detroit. Aleki helped him with the plot.
Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, 2013, avid watcher of his videos, learned how to make the bombs from his magazine. 2015, the Charlie Hebdo brothers admitted they were inspired and financed by Alaki. Fair to say that if Alaki had not become radicalized, we would have seen significantly less terrorism over the last 15 years?
You know, it's always hard to answer that question because you don't know what else these young guys, mostly guys, you know, sort of going out on the internet, might have come across. But I think he sort of offered a unique combination of, first of all, a real grasp of mainstream Islam. This is a guy who had a best-selling boxed set of CDs on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, completely mainstream stuff, spoke perfect Arabic and perfect English, and had a real knack for explaining things. So he could take somebody from mainstream Islam to the notion that it is your religious obligation to go out and kill people. And I think in that way, he was a very powerful and insidious influence in many cases.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review, and you can see all of those programs in their entirety at tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.